Here's a question that nobody in finance wants you to sit with for too long. How many times in recorded human history has a government removed precious metals from its money supply and gotten away with it? Take a guess. 10 times? 5? Maybe 3? The answer is 0. Every single time. No exceptions. No clever workarounds. Every civilization that has pulled silver or gold out of its money and replaced it with a promise has ended up in the same place. Crisis, collapse, reset. And that is not some fringe opinion from a guy selling gold bars out of his basement. That is just what happened. Repeatedly. Across thousands of years, across completely different cultures on opposite sides of the planet, with no contact between them. Different languages, different technologies, different religions, same outcome. Rome did it, China did it, the United States did it. Twice, and every single time, the ending rhymes. So what we're going to do in this video is something I have not seen anyone else attempt in quite this way. We're going to walk through every major precious metal crisis in chronological order, from ancient Rome all the way to right now, today. And I am going to show you that these are not random, disconnected events. They are chapters in the same book, a book that is still being written. And we might be reading the final chapter right now without realizing it, because here is what keeps me up at night. We are currently living in the longest stretch of time in human history where no major global currency is backed by any precious metal whatsoever. Not one, not partially, not symbolically, nothing. The United States dollar, the euro, the yen, the pound, the yuan, all of them are floating on the exact same thing. Trust. That is it. And if history has anything to say about that arrangement, and it has a lot to say, then we are sitting inside the setup for the largest monetary correction any of us will see in our lifetimes. But I am not here to scare you. I am here to educate you. Because understanding history is the closest thing to a superpower that any of us will ever get. So let us start at the very beginning. Ancient Rome. The year is 211 BC. A silver coin is minted for the first time, and the most powerful empire on earth is about to start a mistake that will echo through the next 2,000 years. Picture this. You are a Roman soldier in the 2nd century. You have just spent 6 months on the frontier fighting Germanic tribes in freezing rain. Your boots are falling apart. You have not seen your family in a year. But every month, without fail, a courier rides into camp and hands you a small silver coin, a denarius. That coin is your lifeline. It buys grain, wine, a new cloak. It is real. You can feel the weight of it. And for generations, that weight has meant something because each denarius contained roughly 4.5 grams of almost pure silver, around 95% fineness when the coin was first minted around 211 BC during the Second Punic War against Carthage. The denarius was not just a coin. It was a statement. It told the world that Rome kept its promises. The word denarius literally means containing 10 because it was originally worth 10 smaller bronze coins called asses. It became the backbone of the Roman economy for nearly 500 years. The word for money in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese all descend from it. When you hear someone say dinero, they are speaking the ghost of a Roman coin. Now here is where the story turns, because what the Roman government figured out, slowly, over centuries, is that they could cheat. Not all at once. That would be too obvious. You do not rob a soldier to his face. You do it grain by grain. And that is exactly what they did. Literally, grain by grain of silver. Emperor Nero kicked it off in 64 AD. Rome had just burned in the Great Fire. The treasury was in shambles. Nero needed to rebuild the city and fund his own lavish lifestyle, and he needed to do it fast. So he reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 20% and also shaved down the weight. For every 1 million denarii the treasury collected in taxes, they could now mint 1.2 million new coins from the same pile of silver. On paper, the empire was richer. In reality, they had just invented inflation. But here's the thing about debasing money. It works. For a while. Nero rebuilt Rome. The economy appeared to hum along. Nobody noticed the difference at first because the coins still looked the same, still had the emperor's face stamped on them, still jingled the same way in your leather pouch at the market. So the next emperor did it too, and the next. And the next. It became the default solution to every fiscal problem. War is expensive? Debase the coin? Need to build a wall? Debase the coin. Troops demanding a pay raise? Debase the coin. Under Trajan, around 100 AD, the silver content slipped to roughly 85%. Under Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher emperor who is supposed to be the wisest man in the room, it dropped to about 75%. Even the philosopher could not resist the temptation of the printing press, or in his case, the debasing press. Then Caracalla in 215 AD tried something really clever. He introduced a new coin called the Antoninianus, supposed to be worth 2 denarii but containing only about 1.5 times the silver. It was the ancient world's version of quantitative easing. Create a new financial instrument that looks more valuable than the real thing underneath it. By the time Emperor Gallienus took power in the 260s, the denarius had barely 5% silver left. The coins were essentially bronze slugs with the thinnest possible silver wash on the outside. Researchers at the University of Warwick and the University of Liverpool have analyzed these coins under microscopes, and the debasement was even worse than historians previously thought. Some coins from the late Republic period had been cut with up to 10% copper when they were supposed to be pure, and the economy fell apart exactly how you would expect. Prices exploded. A measure of wine that cost 1/8 of a denarius under Augustus eventually cost 8 full debased denarii under Diocletian's price edict of 301 AD. That is over 6,000% inflation across the lifespan of the currency. Diocletian actually tried to fix the problem by issuing an edict setting maximum prices for goods. The penalty for charging more was death. It did not work. You cannot legislate away inflation. The merchants simply stopped selling. Soldiers noticed the debasement because they always notice first. When your pay buys half the grain it did last year, you start asking questions. When it buys a quarter, you stop asking and start sharpening swords for very different reasons. Military revolts became endemic in the 3rd century. Emperors were assassinated with alarming regularity, often by their own troops, who felt cheated by worthless pay. This is the foundational rule of monetary history, and it never changes. When a government removes real, tangible value from money and replaces it with the government's word, inflation is not a risk. It is a guarantee. It is simply a matter of how long the illusion holds before arithmetic catches up. Rome's version of that arithmetic took about 200 years to fully play out from Nero to the total collapse of the old coinage system. The question for us is whether modern versions of the same trick are running on a faster clock. And based on what happened next, thousands of miles to the east, the answer is a resounding yes. If Rome gave us the first great lesson in monetary debasement, China gave us the second. And this one is arguably more relevant to what is happening today, because China did not just reduce the metal in their coins. They went further. They removed the metal entirely and replaced it with paper. Now, to be fair, China had been experimenting with paper money for centuries before the Ming Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was issuing paper notes as far back as the 11th century, around 997 AD. The idea was practical. Copper coins are heavy. When you are a merchant moving goods across an empire that spans millions of square miles, carrying literal tons of bronze on your back is not ideal. But every Chinese dynasty that embraced paper money eventually drowned in it. The Song overprinted. The Mongol Yuan dynasty that followed overprinted even harder. By the time the Mongols were overthrown in 1368, their paper currency was essentially wallpaper. People were burning it for warmth because it was worth more as fuel than as money. So you would think the Ming emperors, having watched their predecessors collapse under mountains of worthless paper, would have learned something, and at first they seemed to. The first Ming emperor, Hongwu, actually tried to restore copper coins as the primary medium of exchange. He understood what the Mongols had done wrong. He had seen it with his own eyes. But there was a problem. China simply did not have enough copper. The mines in Jiangxi, Shanxi, and Shaanxi could not keep up with the demand of an empire that size. In some provinces, the government was literally ordering citizens to melt down their copper household objects to be turned into coins. So in 1375, 7 years after founding his dynasty, Hongwu's government did the exact thing he had watched destroy the previous regime. They created the Da Ming Bao Chao, the Great Ming Treasure Note, paper money made from mulberry bark, printed with red official seals, and declared valid currency across the entire empire. Forever. That is not an exaggeration. The notes literally stated they would circulate in perpetuity. No expiration date, no geographic restriction, no limit on how many could be printed. These notes were enormous, physically. The 1 guan denomination measured over 36 centimeters tall, making them the largest banknotes ever printed in Chinese history. And right there at the bottom of the note, printed in bold characters, was a warning that still feels relevant today. Counterfeiters would be executed, and anyone who reported a counterfeiter would receive 250 taels of silver, plus the entire confiscated property of the criminal. But there was a problem far more dangerous than counterfeiting. The notes were not backed by anything. Not silver, not gold, not copper, not silk, not land, nothing. The government simply declared them to be money and expected 100 million people to go along with it. And here's where it gets almost darkly comedic. The government paid soldiers and officials in paper. It demanded taxes in paper. But then, increasingly, local provincial governments stopped accepting the paper notes for tax payments. Think about that contradiction for a moment. The entity that created the money was refusing to honor it. That is the financial equivalent of a restaurant refusing to take its own gift cards. The printing never stopped. Every military campaign, every palace renovation, every bureaucratic expansion was funded by running the presses harder. New denominations were introduced. Old worn-out notes could theoretically be exchanged, but the government charged a fee for that service and eventually stopped doing replacements altogether. So people were stuck holding decaying paper that was losing value by the month. By the 1420s, about 50 years after the first notes were issued, the Daming Bao Chao had lost roughly 99% of its original value. Guinness World Records actually references these surviving notes as some of the oldest banknotes in existence. And the reason so many survived is precisely because of the hyperinflation. People needed bundles of notes for basic transactions, so huge quantities were printed and hoarded but never destroyed. The inflation preserved them for history as a cautionary tale. Commerce reverted to barter in many regions. Merchants refused paper altogether. The economy, one of the largest and most sophisticated on the planet at that time, was choking on its own worthless currency. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine if you are paying attention. You know what China ultimately did to fix the problem? They abandoned paper money entirely, completely. Done. Silver bullion, weighed on scales and measured by the tael, became the backbone of Chinese commerce for the next 4 centuries. Not 4 years, 4 centuries. The trauma of the Ming hyperinflation was so deep that China did not touch paper money again until it absolutely had to. When the Qing dynasty took power after the Ming, they explicitly refused to issue paper money, haunted by what they had witnessed. It was not until the 1850s, when the Taiping Rebellion was draining the treasury and 9 million taels in war indemnities were owed to foreign powers after the Opium Wars, that the Qing reluctantly brought back paper. And guess what happened? Hyperinflation. Again. Within 6 years, those notes were worthless too. The government deprecated them entirely by 1859. The pattern is not subtle. Paper money without metal backing gets printed until it fails. Then society scrambles back to precious metals to rebuild trust. Then, after enough time passes and the institutional memory fades, somebody gets the bright idea to try paper again. And the cycle repeats. So now I know what some of you are thinking. Okay, that is ancient China. We are smarter now. We have central banks and sophisticated monetary policy and inflation targeting frameworks. Fair enough. Let us jump forward to the modern era and see how those brilliant tools held up when they were used against silver. 1873. The Gilded Age. Railroads are stitching the American continent together, steel mile by steel mile. Factories are belching smoke across the Northeast. The Comstock lode in Nevada is producing staggering amounts of silver, so much that the metal is pouring into the economy like water through a broken dam. And in Washington, D.C., behind closed doors and buried in procedural language, something very quiet and very consequential is about to happen. On February 12, 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Coinage Act of 1873. On the surface, it looked like a routine administrative bill, a dry revision of the laws governing the United States Mint. The bill had been kicking around Congress since 1870. There was debate about nickel alloys for pennies, discussions about a new trade dollar for Asian commerce, arguments about whether the mint was overpaying for nickel, mundane stuff that would put most people to sleep. But buried inside that bill, in Section 15, was a single omission that would reshape the American economy for the next 3 decades. The standard silver dollar, the coin that had been part of the American monetary system since Alexander Hamilton created it in 1792, was quietly left off the list of coins the mint was authorized to produce. Let me say that again, because it is easy to miss, and that was apparently the entire point. Since the founding of the Republic, the United States had operated on bimetallism. Both gold and silver were money. You could take raw silver bullion to the mint, have it coined into dollars at a ratio of roughly 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, and spend those silver dollars at full face value with unlimited legal tender status. Silver was not just a commodity, it was constitutional money. After the Coinage Act of 1873, that was over. Silver was out. Gold was the sole standard. And almost nobody noticed until it was too late. The miners noticed first, naturally. When Western silver miners showed up at the mint with their bullion and were turned away, they were stunned. But it was farmers who felt it worse, and there were a lot more farmers than miners in 1873 America. For working class Americans, especially in the agricultural South and West, silver had been their financial oxygen. Many paid debts in silver, many earned in silver, and suddenly the metal they depended on had been stripped of its monetary status. Its market price began to fall because the single largest buyer, the United States government, was no longer purchasing it for coinage. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. That exact same year, a financial panic ripped through the American economy like a tornado. Banks collapsed. Railroads went bankrupt. The Vienna Stock Exchange crashed and the contagion spread globally. The country plunged into what historians call the Long Depression, a grinding, relentless economic downturn that lasted from 1873 to 1879. And people started connecting dots. The government had demonetized silver. The money supply contracted violently. Deflation crushed farmers and debtors who owed fixed dollar amounts that were becoming harder and harder to earn as prices collapsed. Meanwhile, creditors and bankers on the East Coast, the ones sitting on piles of gold, watched their purchasing power increase with every deflationary tick. The rich got richer because their gold was worth more. The poor got poorer because their silver was worth less. It was, in the view of millions of Americans, a deliberate wealth transfer engineered through monetary policy. By 1876, a former newspaper editor named George Weston published a letter in the Boston Globe calling the Coinage Act what millions were thinking, a conspiracy by the creditor class against ordinary people. Missouri Congressman Richard Bland, who would earn the colorful nickname Silver Dick, stood on the House floor and declared that the act was a fraud because its title gave no indication of its real intent. He said it had been stealthily passed without proper debate. Even the man who introduced the bill, Representative William Kelly of Pennsylvania, later stated publicly that he was ignorant of the fact that it would demonetize the silver dollar. Whether that was genuine confusion or convenient political amnesia is a question historians have debated for a century and a half. The slogan that emerged from this era, the crime of 1873, became one of the most potent political battle cries in American history. It fueled the entire free silver movement. It created the Populist Party, and it put William Jennings Bryan on a stage at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, where he delivered what many consider one of the greatest political speeches in American history, his Cross of Gold address, in which he thundered that the gold standard was economic oppression designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Bryan lost that election to William McKinley. The gold standard survived, and the message was received loud and clear by anyone paying attention. Governments do not just debase money by putting less silver in coins the way Rome did. Sometimes they change the rules entirely. They rewrite the whole system overnight so that the metal your family has relied on for generations is suddenly not money anymore. Not because it failed, not because people lost faith in it, but because powerful people decided it was inconvenient. And if you think that was the last time the American government would reach into its citizens' pockets and redefine what money is, well, you are about to meet Franklin Delano Roosevelt. April 5th, 1933. The Great Depression is in its fourth grinding year. A quarter of the American workforce is unemployed. Banks are failing by the hundreds. Bread lines stretch around city blocks. Dust storms are burying farms across the plains. And President Franklin Roosevelt, barely a month into his presidency, is about to do something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He signs Executive Order 6102. The language is blunt. All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933. All gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank. The penalty for noncompliance? Up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $10,000. In 1933 dollars, that fine is the equivalent of roughly $250,000 today. The rationale, as the government presented it, was that gold hoarding was making the Depression worse. People were pulling gold out of banks and stuffing it under mattresses, which constrained the Federal Reserve's ability to expand the money supply because the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 required 40% gold backing for every dollar printed. If citizens held the gold, the Fed could not print the money. So Roosevelt ordered the gold returned. Americans were offered $20.67 per troy ounce. That was the official price. You turned in your gold, you got paper in return. Most Americans complied voluntarily, not because they were enthusiastic about it, but because at the time, paper currency still claimed to be redeemable in gold. The dollars felt equivalent. The social contract, however frayed, still held. Frederick Barber Campbell was one of the few who pushed back. He had over 5,000 ounces of gold on deposit at Chase National Bank. When the bank refused to let him withdraw his gold after the executive order, Campbell sued the bank. Federal prosecutors immediately indicted him. A judge eventually overturned his prosecution on a technicality. Roosevelt had signed the order himself instead of the Treasury Secretary as legally required. But the court upheld the government's authority to seize gold. Campbell's metal was confiscated regardless. He was the only person formally prosecuted under Executive Order 6102, but the message was unmistakable. Then came the real move, the one that still makes my jaw tighten. 9 months later, in January 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. This law did two things. First, it transferred all Federal Reserve gold to the United States Treasury. Second, it raised the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Read those numbers again slowly. The government forced citizens to sell their gold at roughly $21 per ounce. Then it immediately repriced that same gold at $35. Overnight, the purchasing power of every paper dollar Americans received in exchange for their metal was diluted. The government effectively captured a 40% gain on gold it had compelled its own citizens to surrender under threat of imprisonment. That is not monetary policy. That is a forced wealth transfer dressed up in legalese. And Americans would not be legally permitted to own gold again for 41 years. It was not until December 31st, 1974, that President Gerald Ford signed Executive Order 1825, finally restoring the right of American citizens to hold gold. 41 years of prohibition on the most ancient store of value in human civilization. But even the gold confiscation was not the final act, because between 1933 and 1974, something even bigger happened, something that changed the entire architecture of global money. August 15th, 1971, a Sunday evening. Most Americans are watching television, not expecting news. Richard Nixon walks into a studio and addresses the nation. He has just spent 3 intense days at Camp David with his top economic advisors, including Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a young undersecretary named Paul Volcker, who would later become one of the most consequential Fed chairmen in history. Nixon looks into the camera and announces what he calls his new economic policy: price and wage freezes. Price, a new tax on imports. And then the key line, delivered with the calm of a man who knows exactly what he is detonating. He has directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That single word did more heavy lifting that night than any word in the English language has done before or since. What Nixon was really doing was killing the Bretton Woods system. Since 1944, when 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire at the end of World War II, the global economy had operated on a framework where foreign governments could exchange their dollars for American gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The dollar was the global anchor, and gold was the chain that held it to reality. But by 1971, the United States had a catastrophic problem. There were 4 times as many dollars circulating around the world as there was gold in Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve vaults to back them. The Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, a full decade of deficit spending had flooded the planet with dollars that America simply could not redeem. Foreign nations started to call the bluff. France literally dispatched a warship to New York to collect its gold reserves. In August 1971, Britain formally requested that $3 billion in gold be transferred from American reserves. West Germany had already abandoned the system months earlier, refusing to keep buying overvalued dollars. So Nixon severed the chain. He framed it as protecting American jobs from international money speculators. He promised the dollar would be worth just as much tomorrow as it was today. And technically, at the grocery store the next morning, it was. But in terms of what a dollar could purchase in gold, the collapse was staggering. Gold went from $35 an ounce in 1971 to over $800 by January 1980. The dollar did not just decline. It cratered against the one thing it had been measured by for centuries. The temporary suspension never ended. The Bretton Woods system was dead. And, for the first time in the modern era, every major currency on earth was backed by nothing but the credibility and discipline of the government that issued it. That is where we have been ever since, over 50 years now, and that brings us to the present day. So let us take stock of where we stand on this 2,000-year timeline. Rome debased its coins over 2 centuries and watched its economy disintegrate. China printed unbacked paper money and saw it become worth less than the mulberry bark it was printed on. The United States demonetized silver, confiscated gold, and then severed the final link between the dollar and any physical metal. Every step of this journey has moved in one direction, away from tangible value, away from metal you can hold in your hand, toward promises, toward paper, toward digits on a screen. And now we are deeper into that experiment than any civilization in human history has ever ventured. But here is what makes the present moment distinct from everything that came before, and this is the part of the video I have been building toward. The precious metals market itself, the one place where gold and silver are still theoretically priced and traded and available to buy, has developed a structural crack that dwarfs anything Rome or China ever faced. It is called the paper-to-physical ratio. And it is, in my view, the single most important number in global finance that almost nobody outside of commodity trading desks is paying attention to. Here's how it works. On the COMEX exchange in New York, which is the primary futures market for precious metals in North America, traders buy and sell silver futures contracts. Each contract represents 5,000 troy ounces of silver and theoretically gives the holder the right to take delivery of physical metal. In theory. In practice, the overwhelming majority of these contracts are settled in cash. Traders buy paper, sell paper, collect or lose the price difference, and never touch a single physical bar. And because creating a new paper contract costs essentially nothing, just a margin deposit, while mining, refining, and delivering a physical ounce of silver requires actual labor, energy, equipment, and time, the number of paper claims has vastly outstripped the amount of actual metal available for delivery. How far has this diverged? According to analyst estimates and COMEX data tracking, the paper-to-physical ratio has reached truly extraordinary levels. Some market observers have calculated ratios exceeding 300 paper ounces for every single physical ounce of deliverable silver in registered vaults. Meanwhile, the global silver market has been running in a structural deficit. meaning demand has exceeded mine supply for multiple consecutive years. The Silver Institute reported annual demand exceeding 1 billion ounces, while global mine production has been unable to keep pace. Think about what that means in practical terms. If even a small percentage of paper holders simultaneously decided to demand physical delivery rather than accepting cash settlement, the system would face a crisis it was never designed to handle. It would function exactly like a bank run, except the bank does not have enough silver in the vault to honor its outstanding claims. And this is not merely theoretical. The silver market has already shown visible signs of stress. COMEX registered inventory, the metal that is actually available for delivery against futures contracts, has been declining. The silver futures market has experienced persistent backwardation, a condition where nearby contracts cost more than contracts further in the future. In a normal, healthy commodity market, futures trade at a premium to spot prices because of storage and financing costs. When that relationship inverts, it is a red flashing signal that people want metal now and do not trust that it will be available later. Meanwhile, industrial demand for silver is accelerating in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Silver is no longer just a monetary metal or a jewelry metal. It has become one of the most critical industrial inputs on the planet. Solar panels require silver paste for their electrical contacts. Electric vehicles use silver in nearly every electrical connection. Semiconductors, the brains of every device you own, depend on silver. Fifth-generation wireless infrastructure, artificial intelligence data centers, defense applications, all of them consume silver in quantities that are growing year over year. And here is the crucial distinction between industrial demand and investment demand. An investor who holds a futures contract can be paid off in cash. That is annoying, but survivable. A manufacturer building solar panels or electric vehicles cannot use cash to replace silver. They need the physical atoms. They need the metal itself, in bars, in their factory, on their production line. You cannot solder a circuit board with a financial derivative, which means industrial consumers are becoming increasingly price insensitive. They will pay whatever it costs to secure their supply, because the alternative is shutting down production lines worth billions of dollars. So you have a situation where paper claims are multiplying, physical supply is tightening, industrial demand is structurally locked in, and the inventories that bridge the gap between paper and reality are shrinking visibly. The historical precedents we walked through today, Rome, China, the crime of 1873, the gold confiscation of 1933, the Nixon shock of 1971, they all tell the same story wearing different costumes. When paper promises diverge too far from physical reality, reality eventually reasserts itself. The correction is not optional, it is mathematical. The only open questions are timing and magnitude. So what do we actually take away from all of this? After 2,000 years of evidence, what are the lessons? The first is the simplest. This is not new. What is happening to our monetary system right now has happened before, many times, on every continent, in every era. The details change, the technology evolves, the faces on the coins and the signatures on the bills rotate, but the pattern does not. Remove tangible value from money, replace it with promises, and eventually the system corrects. That is not a prediction. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a historical observation with a sample size spanning 2 millennia and crossing every civilization that tried. The second lesson is that these corrections always catch people off guard because they happen gradually, then suddenly. The Roman soldier did not notice the silver leaving his coin because it happened 1 percentage point at a time over decades. Chinese merchants did not refuse the paper until it was already worthless. American farmers did not realize silver had been demonetized until they showed up at the mint with their bullion and were turned away. Citizens did not fully grasp what Nixon had done until gold prices quintupled. By the time the public recognizes what has happened, the transfer of wealth has already occurred. The people who understood the system early have already repositioned. And the third takeaway, the one I most want to leave with you, is this. Understanding the history we just walked through together is not about making one trade or buying one asset. It is about seeing the world clearly. Once you understand that money is not a fixed, permanent thing, but a tool that governments have manipulated, debased, confiscated, and redefined over and over throughout history, you make fundamentally different decisions about how you store your time and energy. You stop trusting blindly. You start verifying. You ask harder questions. And that is worth more than any investment tip anyone could ever give you. If this video made you think, if it connected some dots you had not connected before, I would genuinely appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. I plan to go much deeper on these topics. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of this timeline surprised you the most. And if you know someone who needs to see this, that share button is right below. Thank you for your time. This one mattered to me. I will see you in the next one.